Post-COVID, much has changed, and the need for leadership agility has increased. However, within so much change, where does one start? Let's ask Chuck Mollor, the author of The Rise of the Agile Leader. Can you make the shift? Chuck, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
So you've written a new book called The Rise of the Agile Leader. Can you make the shift? So let's start right away by asking the question, what is the biggest challenges of businesses today?
That's a loaded question. I would say the biggest challenges of business today is focus, right? There's so many distractions. The needs of your customers, no matter what your business is, the changing landscape of how customers are making decisions in terms of purchase and why. And those are individual consumers all the way up to corporations. While you're doing all that, while you're trying to figure out your strategies and shifting your strategies on a non-constant basis, then how do I stabilize my workforce? How do I retain my top talent? How do I keep them engaged? How do I manage them in the multi-generations and virtual and hybrid workforce management and challenges and so on? So I think the combination of those two things is maybe the biggest challenge we've ever seen in the business world.
So what would you say more specifically for the leaders of today that was different than, let's say, 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, we can actually probably argue 2 years ago, COVID definitely has had a major impact, clearly, but I would go back at least 5 years ago, and to your point, 10, to say that the world's changed. The speed of change is probably the biggest change, Katrina, that we have. The speed of innovation, the cycles of innovation have gotten shorter and shorter. By the time you release a new product, a new service, clients are already waiting for the next version. So the speed of change, the intensity of change is probably the biggest change. And what those implications are for leaders is how do I manage that, the constant competition, the global competition, the local competition, the impact of technology, right? How we purchase, how we make decisions now through technology dramatically changed the last 10 years. Again, the implications are for leaders, and one last comment to that would be how employees think of their careers, how they think of their jobs has changed dramatically the last 10 years. So as a leader, how do I create this sense of culture, this sense of belonging that reflects not only my external brand, but that's also now my internal brand that attracts top talent, where top talent want to be here, want to have a career here, and that will help execute our strategy and our vision and our purpose to be successful. And all the specifics of that is daunting. So that's the biggest challenge right now and the biggest changes the last 10 years.
So what would you suggest to leaders to how to best manage their careers?
I think the biggest thing I would emphasize as a leader today is they need to think of leadership itself as a specific skill, a craft, a profession. I think the biggest challenges leaders today have is leadership or management is sort of a secondary thing they do. Their primary focus is their functional expertise. What's made them successful, why they've advanced, why they've taken on more responsibility. And leadership is, yes, part of that job. But I think the biggest advice is you need to treat leadership as a craft, as a profession into itself. And you need to be constantly learning, constantly fine-tuning that craft to be successful in today's time.
So what do you do to help them do that?
I think there's a couple of things you have to do. One, you have to start with yourself. You need to understand what kind of leader you are, what your gaps are, what your challenges are, what happens to you under pressure and stress. And frankly, what does that mean for the organization that you work in? Every organization has a different definition of what leadership is. So what is that leadership culture? What do they mean by leadership? And to even get more micro, what organization do you work in if you're working for a big company? Because every part of a company has its own sort of culture, microculture, right? And your boss has its own sort of leadership expectation and style. So understanding your leadership style, what kind of leader you are, what your gaps are, what your needs are to be effective as a leader, that's a really important starting point for any manager at any level in their career. And from there, how to develop a roadmap that allows me to really understand the aspects of leadership that I need to get more effective at.
Can you give us an example of two companies you've worked with and two leaders within those companies and how they had to adapt to that particular culture?
Yeah, I've got one particular leader in mind, a very, very sharp young man that came out of a very, very specific organization in consulting and went into high tech and was doing very, very well, but quickly moved up in his career where he took on a very, very large responsibility, very great visibility in the organization, was working directly with the CEO and the executive team in a very, very visible, high impact role. Unfortunately for this person, they were not as effective in managing their own team and their own organization. And they're taking very much a sort of a consulting sort of approach to how they manage. Without getting to all the details and minutia, I think providing that particular executive feedback in terms of understanding how they were perceived as a leader. And you do that two different ways, right? Best practices when it comes to leadership development is often both a behavioral assessment as well as some type of 360 feedback assessment. In this case, these were interviews. So it was a verbal 360 feedback assessment. And through that feedback, he received sort of, you want to call it a current roadmap of here's how you're perceived. No, by the way, your behavioral assessment says, here's your natural profile. Here's your natural leadership style. So where are those gaps? Where are there opportunities to learn how to be more effective and how to learn to be not only more situationally effective? Because most of us as leaders, we typically are strong in a number of areas, and we don't want that to change. And often we're also very strong within our stakeholder groups, right? We may be very good at managing up. We may be very good at managing across the organization. And maybe our weakness is not as being effective as managing our people, or vice versa. We're very good at managing our people, but not necessarily managing up. So in this case, this person had to become much more effective in managing their organization, managing their people. And they frankly need to really learn how to be more effective when it comes to emotional intelligence and how they show up and how to respond in a non-emotional manner. So we worked on a number of things, Katrina: emotional management, emotional intelligence, and really developing some leadership skills and techniques that frankly was not in his toolbox. And that would be everything from how he coached, how he influenced, his ability to be more vulnerable, his ability to understand what really motivating, inspiring his people were versus just holding them accountable to metrics and to results. So there were a number of things over a period of 6 to 9 months that we worked on. To his credit, and it really does come down to the leader themselves, to his credit, he transformed in front of everybody's eyes over a period of 6 to 9 months and still is on that journey, as we always will be on that journey. So that's a very specific example of a person that where we had a sort of a understanding of what his challenges were and how, to his credit, he was able to develop these new skills, these new abilities, frankly, have new awareness of the impact he has on others. And a big part of it also, frankly, was his ability to establish trust and build relationships. And I think if there's anything that I think the majority of leaders today need to really focus on, especially in a hybrid and more virtual workforce environment, is this notion of how do I establish trust and build relationships when I've got people in office, out of office, or people I never even meet in person.
So you help them with that. And how do you help them with that? You have a book now. I also want to cover that, How to Rise of the Agile Leader, The Rise of the Agile Leader. So what's the roadmap you propose for them to be more agile? And please define what you mean by agile.
Yeah, so thank you. I did write this book, The Rise of the Agile Leader, Can You Make This Shift? The focus of the book is really meant to do two things. One, I wanted to talk about the future of leadership. So something I asked my team a few years ago, which is, what is the future of leadership? Now, as you already asked a little bit earlier, leadership's been changing dramatically the last 10 years. It's not just been the last 2 years because of COVID. COVID just accelerated that, right? And for all the reasons we've already sort of highlighted, the cycles of innovation are getting shorter, the intensity of change is faster and more intense than ever. The needs and the complexities of the workforce have increased tremendously over the years. So for a number of reasons, the effectiveness of a leader needs to adapt. And so we started interviewing CEOs, we interviewed clients, we interviewed hundreds of companies, and we looked at some of the existing research, and we came up with a new leadership model, which we coined the Agile Leader. And again, to your question, Agile is the verb, Agile, not the methodology of Agile that's been around for 30 years. So we're talking about Agile, the verb, how to be able to shift and adapt and move quickly in your environment. And that's really critical for a leader today. So we came up with this leadership model called the Agile Leader. But in addition to that, I also wanted to provide a roadmap for any leader at any level, no matter where they are in their career, what their challenges are. It says, here's a roadmap to get to the next level of effectiveness as a leader. So the book is really a number of different methodologies and practical tools and approaches and strategies that allow a leader to be able to internalize and bring those toolkits to their effectiveness. So that was the intent of the book.
So tell us a little bit more about the roadmap and what is the process of that roadmap?
Yeah, so I don't have a copy of the book in front of me. I know, or else I can pull out the chapters, but the book covers a number of things, right? So as I already used my previous executive as an example, it starts with self-awareness, right? So using behavioral assessment, using an assessment I like to use, by the way, it's called the Predictive Index, or PI. It's been around since 1955. It's easy to take. It's very, very accurate behavioral assessments in the world. But most importantly, it translates so nicely into what your natural leadership style is. So kind of understanding who you are as a person, how you respond to pressure and stress, what your natural leadership style is. Let me give you some very tangible examples. So, how authoritative are you? How collaborative are you? How independent are you? How assertive you are as a leader? How focused are you on relationships versus being the subject matter expert? How you establish trust? How you deal with change? How you deal with risk? What kind of natural decision-making style, your natural communication style, how you deal with conflict naturally. These are all things that are critical for any employee, but especially as a leader. So PI measures all these things. So understand that is really, really critical to understand how you're perceived by others. So the power of feedback, whether it's through a 360 assessment or your ability to ask for feedback in an effective, meaningful way is so critical. So those are some of the things that we cover in this book, but there are a number of chapters in terms of how to manage change effectively, how to build a high-performing team, how to deal with, I like to refer to as the secret sauce of being an effective leader. There's so many elements that are covered in this book.
Yeah, you mentioned the X factor in being an effective leader in your book. What do you mean by X factor?
Well, there's many X factors, but to be very specific, an X factor would be, frankly, going back to what I said earlier, who are you as a leader? What do you aspire to be as a leader? How do you show up as a leader every day? How do you think about yourself in terms of yourself and your health? One of the things I talk about in the book is the two-sided coin, right? There is self-acceptance and self-development. We all seem to focus on, let's get better, let's get more effective. Let's face it, when you become a manager, you're advancing because you've done something really, really well. You're typically great at getting results. You're a fast learner. You have drive. You have hunger. Leaders are often people who have worked hard to get to where they are. So it's very challenging. All of a sudden, one day, someone says you need to continue to develop yourself as a leader. But frankly, one of the harder things is self-acceptance. And, to be effective as a leader, you have to be comfortable in your own skin. Doesn't mean you're always going to be happy with everything you do. It doesn't mean that you're not going to fail and make mistakes. But you have to accept yourself. So self-acceptance along with self-development is so critical as a leader. So it's one of the elements I talk about. And again, I can go on, but that's just an example.
Wonderful. Wonderful. It's a good, tangible book to help leaders in their career and emphasize it as a skill in itself rather than an adjunct skill to competence they have, a functional competence. So what would you say are the biggest challenges facing leaders in the future?
Boy, I think the challenges are not going to go away. How do I establish culture in an organization when half my people or most of my people or a third of my people are not in the office, or we didn't hire them in person, we're not managing them in person? Now, again, hybrid's not new or virtual's not new, right? If you've been working internationally or nationally around the world, it's not a new concept, but for a lot of people, especially managing that is new. How do I build healthy teams, people feeling connected, feeling part of an organization, part of a mission, part of a purpose when they are virtual? I think that's not going to go away. The new generation in the workforce has a different mindset. They want inclusion, and whether you live in the United States or work in the United States or not, You could be anywhere in the world. And yes, maybe DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion is not as focused on outside of the US as it is here in the US. But this generation wants to know, what are you doing to create an inclusive workforce where people feel appreciated and accepted? The concept of psychological safety, this whole notion of, do I have a voice? Am I able to bring my ideas to the table? Can I challenge the status quo? Can I say I have a different opinion? Will that be accepted? Will that be heard? Can I make a mistake and fail without being persecuted, lose my job? I mean, these are all such critical aspects now that as a leader, you have to learn how to navigate in such an effective way.
So what advice do you give them, or coaching do you provide to help them provide that psychological safety for their employees?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually been one of the probably big themes over the last 2 years, especially because of the impact of COVID on people in terms of their mental health and their emotional health. And of course, the stress and pressure of many, many businesses now struggling with post-COVID business models and business performance. So psychological safety on a very practical level is really about creating a work environment that people feel accepted and valued. So we think about being accepted and valued as something that we take for granted. But let me share you some research, Katrina. And this past year, research was done in terms of, we had this huge surge of turnover, people leaving companies, the great resignation. Why? Why were people leaving? Well, of course, organizations said they were leaving because of money. They were leaving because of stress related to working virtually and some of the mental health aspects, and because of the instability, what's going on in their companies. And I'm not saying those are not, real reasons, but guess what? When employees are asked why they were leaving, their top two reasons were not feeling appreciated and valued. So if you want psychological safety, if you get beyond the actual words, it's about creating a healthy work environment. That's not new concept by any means, but it's new today because it means something different today. Today, it means that people want to feel appreciated and valued, that people want to know it's okay to have a voice and disagree or agree, that people want to know what their opinions are, and that you as a manager and a leader are going to accept those opinions. If anything, you're going to ask people for their opinions, especially for those who are quiet and don't say much. We talk about innovation all the time, and I mentioned earlier the cycle of innovation is getting shorter and shorter. The biggest disconnect by leadership today in most companies is they all want innovation. Why? Because innovation means growth. It means new competitiveness in terms of competitive advantages potentially for a business. But guess what? Innovation comes with a price. It's called failure. There is no such thing as innovation without failure. Yet as a leader, we forget that sometimes. We are wired that way early in our career. As we take on more responsibility, as we start getting focused more on risk and performance and maintaining shareholder value and pressures from whether it's the stock market, Wall Street, investors, private equity, whatever your business may be, your family, we forget that without that failure, without those mistakes, innovation doesn't happen.
A lot of leaders are very competent in their area, as you mentioned earlier. But let's say you have a leader that gets feedback from your research that says he doesn't appreciate or value his employees. Okay, now he's aware. So what do you do to help him change his behavior to make them feel appreciated?
Question. I think first we have to find out, what does that mean, right? When the feedback is your people don't feel appreciated and valued, I think that's really the question. What does that translate into both action and behavior? So for example, what do you do to recognize or reward? Tell me about conversations that you have with people when it's not about an agenda, about financial performance or business performance. What are you doing to develop relationships with people that, in your organization? How much time do you spend having ad hoc conversation? I mean, one of the biggest challenges we're seeing today, Katrina, is that everyone's running from one Zoom or video meeting to another, and people are not having those ad hoc conversations that you would naturally do when you're in person. So one of the things that in that example, those are some of the questions I would start off with. Tell me about what you're doing in all these areas. I've got one very, very senior executive running a very big international business right now. That was one of his issues. People don't feel appreciated and valued. One, for a couple of reasons. He's not empowering them. He's more command and control. And for those who don't understand that, he's basically telling people what to do and not to do. So he had a shift. Again, assuming he's interested in making this shift, how to shift from telling to asking, how to shift from facilitating dialogue versus simply telling people what to do. Because you're not going to get innovation. You're not going to get people to make suggestions and provide ideas if you're simply telling them what to do or not to do based upon your financial objectives or your business objectives. So in a lot of ways, you have to literally take a step back and say, is my management style, leadership style working? What do I need to do? Because it goes beyond just feeling appreciated and valued. It really goes back to levels of empowerment, decision-making, ownership, levels of engagement. And that all equates into feeling appreciated and valued, right? It's a number of things.
Right, absolutely. So you explain it more on on your latest book, The Rise of the Agile Leader. So we're coming to the end of our podcast. What tip would you say for a young leader that's coming into the market today? Just to conclude, what would you say for them to be, have a better chance of success?
A few things. Managing people is very difficult. Understand and accept that. It's hard. It is not easy. You have to have courageous dialogue. You have to have honest, transparent, yet respectful conversations with people. If they're not demonstrating the right values, the right behavior, and doing their job effectively. But do it with empathy. Demonstrate you care about them as people. If there's anything I would say to any manager, especially starting off, in the world we live in today, care. Show that you care. If a person's fumbling and a person's not struggling, maybe their mood's off and they're frustrated or angry, or all of a sudden they're missing deadlines, don't just jump to what's going on. This is not acceptable. That's the old way of thinking. The new way of thinking is, are you okay? What can I do to help you? I know we all have off days and off weeks. Show you care about them as a person. That's the advice I would give to anybody today.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burris's CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.